Nintendo's development philosophy has always been summed up with Game Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi's immortal aphorism, lateral thinking with withered technology. Perhaps the Switch 2 exemplifies this philosophy more than most by repurposing a technology so old school it'd practically be passe to Plato into a new gameplay mechanic that seems to be utilized in games like Dragon Drive, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, and the Jamboree TV expansion to Super Mario Party Jamboree at least. But if those dual mouse controls open up new and tantalizing possibilities, just imagine the uses to which Nintendo could put the Switch 2 camera. This isn't a new technology, and Microsoft and others have utilized this for games in the past, but in Nintendo's hands, I truly think this could be revolutionary. From Ring Fit to Super Mario Bros., and from the frenzy of arms to much more sedate and unique play experiences, let's talk about the power and potential of the Switch 2 USB camera. Never before has a full body camera been a possibility for gaming in a Nintendo space, and in certain respects, it still isn't. Not every gamer will go for the Switch 2 camera, which represents a further $50 charge on top of an already $450 system. As I said in multiple videos before launch, I expected them to avoid tipping too close to the $500 window, but closing the gap with accessories, and that seems to be the case here. But to their credit, Nintendo have said that any compatible USB-C camera will work. The extent to which this is true will remain to be seen, and my recent developer interview gives some insight, but I truly think that in the years to come, this may be the most consequential change of the Switch 2 era. Not the mouse mode, not the graphics, not the magnets. No, it's the camera. Now, I don't expect that to be the case for the next few months, or perhaps not even for the next couple of years. The purpose of the camera, as stated, is chiefly to offer game chat. I may in a separate video explore game chat as its own specific concern, as I do think it's a very interesting concept, but let's stick with the camera functionality as it pertains within games for the moment. The kinds of people who will adopt the camera will tend to be those casual players who enjoy titles like Super Mario Party Jamboree and who enjoy the social functionality of games. It seems less likely that early adopters of Metroid Prime 4 or even Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza are going to share the same interest, at least to the same degree, in broadcasting their reactions to the world, and so I would guess that take up of the camera will remain relatively low early on. Nintendo doesn't really want to issue too many games that are going to be paywalled behind having a particular accessory in the early days of their system, because it will simply suppress sales, and this is why I believe there is only one, arguably only half of one, game that makes use of the gimmick so far, the Jamboree TV Plus game. And as presented, it seems like a fun but fairly gimmicky in nature title. It puts you, the player, onto the stage with Bowser. It allows you to see the faces of the people you interact with as you play with them. It just makes the whole party experience a lot more personalized and integrates the play experience with the social experience a lot better. I know some people whose mindset is geared towards core experiences and who can be less interested in this kind of thing, but I think it's an absolutely fantastic innovation that is likely to do very well and really enhance the fun and value proposition of Super Mario Party. As much as Nintendo's innovations are to allow more varied and better experiences of titles like Mario and Zelda, they also want to create more facility for new types of play in games such as Jamboree. But once the gimmick has worn off, what else can it do? I guess the lowest hanging fruit would be their next iteration of Ring Fit Adventure. This is a title that I absolutely love, and it's a big seller for the company, so you would theoretically expect it to come back in a big way. However, there are problems. Do you sell a second Pilates ring, or do you have two versions? And since this is one of the games that utilizes the IR camera of the original Switch, it's not going to work nearly as well without it. I do think there is a 50% chance, therefore, that we get a Switch 2 edition of Ring Fit Adventure in the next 3 years, but where the Pilates ring, now shorn of its Joy-Con attachment, but perhaps now given its own built-in IR camera, is sold as an optional extra accessory, just as the camera is. Now, the camera would pick up the ring and be able to make judgments about what is happening as long as it was positioned right. Nintendo have already confirmed that there will be a whole body game in the recent Game Chat Ask the Developer interviews. So this would allow the original game to be overhauled with new DLC and levels, perhaps, I really hope, levels that utilise all the mainline Nintendo IP that they're so keen at present to promote. But they could also sell it to Switch 2 users indefinitely. And of course, they can do a much broader fitness game with far more specific guidance on warm-ups and cooldowns and particular exercises. It could even photograph what you look like doing various exercises and then create an outline model of how you should look, track you doing it, and give you a percentage for how close you get. Shades here of the challenges in Super Mario Odyssey where you need to draw a circle blind. Moreover, if they can track your hand movements, the potential for a new Switch Sports, so many years after Kinect Sports tried to fish in the same pond, is huge. Not only can they track your precise location far more easily, but because of the precise hand movements, they can allow for much more specific movements of tennis rackets or golf clubs. Assuming that they are careful to specify and test out particular playing spaces, they could even simulate free movement across tennis and volleyball courts, with the game itself keeping track of whether you're going too far out of bounds because of whether you're too far out of the bounds of the camera. However, Nintendo's current interest is to blend social experiences with gaming. Working out can be quite a solitary activity, but communal workouts could also be motivating, and I could well imagine the potential for a multiplayer Ring Fit version to be compelling as long as they only show the undaunted gaming avatar striding around the screen and not the exhausted player behind the ring. In the Game Chat interview, they did mention the possibility of using Game Chat with Ring Fit Adventure, but I'm not quite sure how many people will be all that keen to do so. So yes, this camera is amazing for exercise games, but I think we could also see these kinds of activity-based control schemes brought into more standard franchises. One thing that occurs to me as possible is a perfect 40th anniversary title for Super Mario Bros. This is such a weird idea that I'm not going to call it as likely or even give it a particular forecast, because obviously the idea is so specific that it's very unlikely that Nintendo would alight upon it in the same way, but it would follow their line of thinking. Essentially, what if you could use the camera to put yourself into the original Super Mario Bros. Game or a variant of it and physically play the level, acting as the sprite? Instantly, you'll be thinking of all the obvious problems. For one thing, the camera is front-facing and the cord will not extend to the side. Well, I don't think this is a problem, as we've already seen it taking still images to use in the Super Mario Party Jamboree demo. The game would simply ask you before you start off to show yourself running, jumping, walking and looking to the side and save these images in lieu of the character sprite file. But what about controlling the character? In theory, it could detect you running on the spot and jumping, but it would be hard to determine the height of the jump. Therefore, you would need to show it an ordinary jump and a high jump so it can calculate your baseline jumping ability. This isn't too different from the way Ring Fit Adventure asks you to, and I forget the exact phrasing, do a gentle jog and a more intense run, and also gives you regular opportunities to adjust the settings. Of course, even if your individual avatar didn't appear in the Mario game, you could still use these kinds of controls to control Mario. There are different ways the game could work for different people as well. In Super Mario Run, the company already pioneered an auto-run version of Mario where you just need a single button press, so theoretically if the only input you need is to jump, then you could play a version of Super Mario Run on the screen straight off, simply by jumping physically in your living room. Now imagine playing a version of Super Mario Bros. 35 like this, with perhaps 40 different people competing physically across a specially adapted classic Super Mario Bros. Course. This just feels so Nintendo-ish that I can practically feel the full beam of Miyamoto's grin as he introduces it. And although I'm not a game developer or even especially technical, and I would defer to the always excellent Sun Grand Studios of the world for more specific insights into what's possible, it strikes me that component parts towards such an experience have been in place in existing games, from the camera to the fitness mechanic of Ring Fit to the player recording in Jamboree TV to the multiplayer aspects of the 99 series. It's just a case of stitching these things together. Then we have something like Tomodachi Life. Tomodachi was a pretty major hit on the 3DS on the quiet, and despite the 13-year wait for a new title, I have no doubt that the Switch version will turn out to be very popular as well. Perhaps they will do a full Switch 2 sequel, but I could also see that they may use this as a Switch 2 edition title, offering a very specific variant on the play experience. Currently, the title appears to be predominantly a single player experience, but what if there were multiplayer options, and what if you could enter into the Tomodachi Life world either in person, as far as the camera records you at that time, or as yourself transposed into Mii form? The Miis always were an approximation of the particular features you choose to utilize, but imagine now if they could track your own gestures and movements and look in real time, but change your voice as you wanted and otherwise allowed you to have a virtual avatar that is responsive to your real life movements so that it actually tracks what you're doing. Or what about arms? Currently, the Switch game offers a fairly compelling boxing style experience if you use motion controls, but if there is one thing that I think could add hugely to the opportunities the game presents, it's the way the camera would offer finger tracking technology. Sure, you can use your arms in a fist in the traditional manner, but this is not fundamentally just a boxing game, but a game with hugely complex mechanical arms that are swappable. What if, using finger gestures, you could change arms or adapt your approach mid-battle? What if you could not just punch but slap or chop or scoop at a distance, using particular hand movements, changing entirely the range of potential options and opening the gameplay up hugely? And then I'm struck by the potential of the camera to facilitate sign language. There are, of course, a great many different regional sign languages, and since the advent of cochlear implants in the 1980s, the number of people in many of Nintendo's key markets purely reliant on sign languages have decreased. There have also been many initiatives that have promoted sign language, but I think on balance, using an existing sign language is unlikely to hold much interest to Nintendo from a gameplay perspective in the short term, because it is too niche and the learning barrier is too high for it to be a broadly commercial concept. But it isn't just humans who use sign language. Sign is often also used to communicate with chimpanzees, and it strikes me that there is huge potential in a new virtual pet simulator that uses bespoke signs to allow you to communicate with your, for want of a better name, Nintenchimp. By simplifying down communication, you avoid the difficult nuances and you can create a parasocial experience that combines the simplicity and cleanness of Animal Crossing with an unprecedented level of interactivity. I'm sure you don't need me to list off the many other titles from Just Dance to Sing Party where having a physical avatar of yourself imported into the game through the power of camera technology could be great fun, but I think we've just only scratched the surface of this camera's vast potential. The current camera, after all, is a front-facing living room experience, but document cameras are relatively inexpensive, perfect examples of withered technology. I have a perfectly good document camera that I've been using for years, which cost about £30 and has a highly flexible gooseneck head and broadcasts at 1080p. Nintendo could easily develop their own document camera to connect to the Switch 2. Now I hear the objections already. This wouldn't work in TV mode unless you were right next to the Switch 2. Sure, that would be true if these were wired, but what if they worked remotely? Broadcasting from screen to screen seems to be a huge aspect of Nintendo's recent technological explorations ever since the days of Wii U, and Switch 2 clearly uses these with tech like GameShare and even Game Chat. Even if this were not possible, Nintendo can easily just supply a longer wire across the room. Wireless play has been around a long time, but people subsisted in the days of wired controllers just fine. And why am I saying controllers? Well, because I see these document cameras less as just a pure camera and more as a wholly new kind of game controller which could be employed for a range of future games. Imagine, if you will, a document camera attached to a slate. Essentially, it uses as an input anything that comes into the field of vision of the camera, and you would control it primarily by putting your hand or hands underneath or by drawing on the slate. Because these would be relatively cheap, it would be possible to make and sell controllers for multiplayer experiences, making the games essentially use a different kind of Joy-Con. Let's call them, for the sake of having a name, Drawcon. Now, let's consider the types of games that a Drawcon could provide. First of all, Art Academy to Mario Paint would be revolutionized. very specific hand movements that for decades have been the preserve of Wacoms or highly sensitive gamepads are now capturable, meaning that you could move your hand with a pencil under the Drawcon and have a screen render that movement as a drawing in pen, paint, pencil, or anything else. If they sold an accessory which, using some kind of haptic feedback perhaps, gave different levels of feedback depending on the type of item you use, the feel of using chalk as opposed to using gel pens could be quite a striking experience. As a means of offering artistic expression, previously the reserve of more PCs or at least tablet users' experiences, this could lift the Switch 2 into a new territory for gaming, but this is Nintendo. They're not going to want to just do their own version of something like Procreate. Traditional games involve you controlling a player and the game supplying the world in which you operate, but occasionally games have taken a different approach. The addictive browser game Line Rider is nearly 2 decades old, but is still great fun. And to play, you simply draw lines that will be used as a sledging course for the sledging main character. You draw the course and the character will drop in, progressing at different speeds depending on the slope of the lines, or possibly falling to a terrible death if you've left gaps in the course that the character's momentum can't allow him to fly past. The scope for Nintendo to do something based on this idea where you draw the world around the character and have to solve drawing-based solutions to challenges has to be huge. Think of the Dungeon Maker in Link's Awakening. There were a certain number of traps and standard objects that you could put in, but basically they were fairly limited. But with a rectangular slate, you could sketch out a dungeon far more intuitively using particular shorthand images to represent flames, pits, and such like. Instead of having to go down a long list of options, you could just add dots to a floor to make it sandy or colour in an area to make it a hole. I'm not sure, oddly, that this would work so well with Mario Maker, where the levels are much bigger and the traps more specific and which would require a lot more drawing. The Wii U gamepad approach works much better for this, but of course the Drawcon could essentially function as a Wii U controller as well in many respects. But for a Zelda dungeon, I think it would soon feel like by far the most intuitive and fun way to create a many and varied interactive puzzle runs by simply sketching them out. Clearly, the challenge of designing a Zelda dungeon maker does remain ferocious, and I'm not sure I necessarily expect one. Most of these dungeons require a degree of lateral thinking, and so allowing players enough design flexibility to permit that lateral thinking, even when they know the designer's toolbox and the boundaries of the game's format, must be an incredible technical challenge, and it's difficult to imagine how it could be made to feel satisfying. Still, allowing people to draw their own maps feels like a way that the game could be much freer. Imagine being able to draw your own Land of Hyrule, adding traps and secrets and puzzles and trees, drawing signs and houses and having them rendered into 3D by the game. And that's before we get onto the really good stuff. If you thought this channel would be content with just the one off-the-wall knitting themed video in a year, then all I can say is, you sweet, sweet summer child. No, knitting, stitching, and crocheting is a skill I've always admired, but not something I've ever been particularly good at. But a pair of knitting needles under a visualizer is all you would need to make the basis for a truly excellent knitting game. With real-life knitting under the camera, the game would be able to give feedback and suggestions, and through game chat, knitters of the world could be knitted together into a group. Nintendo wouldn't even need to make a game out of it. If they could make Switch 2 and the HandCon a social location for knitters to share their craft and chat as they knit, they would benefit from association with a huge global hobby. And yet, we all know that Nintendo will be very interested in gamifying the knitting experience, as they have done indeed in the past. However, as I've covered knitting extensively before, and what self-respecting Nintendo channel hasn't, I shall link my past thoughts on this topic at the end and move on before we get too tangled up. Of course, one of the major fields that utilizes visualizers is the field of education. During the pandemic, many people experienced the dubious joys of lockdown learning and found it hugely difficult in some respects. We know that lockdown shaped the development of Switch 2, with aspects of the game chat functionality, such as the ability to share your screen, coming naturally out of the sort of features that were used by Nintendo developers during the lockdown period. I won't go too far into this at this stage, since the vast potential for Nintendo of entering the education market is something that merits its own video, but suffice to say that creative use of camera technology could be literally game-changing in this space, just as the full-body camera offered by the existing Switch 2 camera is going to give Nintendo far more leeway to enter the space of exercise games. This video has certainly introduced some wild and wacky concepts, and my contention is not that the next couple of years will be packed with Super Mario Jump and Ring Stitch adventures, but nevertheless, I think this camera technology, both body cameras and document cameras, represent a goldmine of underused potential innovation in the field of play, far beyond the normal kinds of experiences video game companies have offered in the past. Moreover, while traditionally Nintendo has focused on specific types of play experience, with only brief flurries, especially during the Iwata era, of explicitly pursuing markets that broaden the total addressable market of gaming, I think long term they are going to want, yet again, to try to find ways to sell their machines to people who would, in the normal course of events, have little intrinsic interest in a Nintendo console, whether they be yarn bombers, educators, or fitness enthusiasts. As much as I try to put these forecasts into a measurable form so I can be held accountable for accuracy later on, it does feel difficult to do so here. I would say there's a 50% chance that we will learn about another game that utilizes the camera for a gameplay specific mechanic before the end of the 2025-26 financial year, even if the game doesn't release in this period. I think there being a fitness game using the camera by the end of 2027 has to be 70% likely, and even more likely thereafter. In fact, it was already strongly hinted at by some of the team on the Game Chat project. As for the possibility of Nintendo using document camera style tech, this has to be lower in the short term. Maybe 10% that we see either any kind of document camera functionality used by Nintendo before the end of 2027. But in the long term, this seems like an add-on with absolutely colossal potential that I would be very interested in seeing utilized. Thanks as ever for sticking with this particularly wild and wacky survey of how the camera could be used. If you missed the knitting video, it's on screen. Please do also check out the Patreon, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.